When you think of the best reward vehicles, you're probably thinking of things like the Object 260, the Object 279E. However, this vehicle right here, the Chimera, is actually a super strong vehicle at tier 8, and what makes it even better is that it gets 440 alpha damage on a medium tank that is also capable of going 50 kilometers an hour. A real gem that I think a lot of people miss, and when they get the 279E they probably completely forget about what this tank is all about. And this one is certainly one that I would personally recommend grinding towards. It is a really fun vehicle and gives you something a little bit different having high alpha on a medium at tier 8. So with that being said, what is special other than just the alpha? Well, the combined speed of this vehicle with 50 kilometers an hour makes it relatively fast to get into position, and to all intents and purposes the Chimera is almost a hybrid between a heavy and a medium tank in terms of how you can kind of play it. Now, I don't think anyone is going to be saying that this is a heavy tank in terms of its armor model, and we'll get into the armor in a second, but ultimately this tank is all about kind of supporting your heavy tanks on flanks and being able to use that high alpha by poking corners, trying to get opponents to track you as opposed to dealing damage, and just using the kind of brawling nature that this tank has and that massive gun to be able to remove some of the enemy vehicles. So with that in mind, obviously we've set up the tank in a specific way to maximize how much we can actually deal in games and just generally feel the best performance out of the vehicle. Now, if you're wondering how to set up a tank like this, well, we've gone with stabilizers in order to reduce that dispersion of this vehicle, because when you've got 440 alpha and the accuracy of this tank is not amazing, you want to make sure that when you are moving and you're having to come to a stop quite suddenly, you're going to be able to actually hit your opponent. So with the reduced dispersion when you're moving, this is really nice for kind of maintaining accuracy over the kind of speed of the vehicle that you can go, because ultimately, yes, you could have really good accuracy when you're stationary, but if it's taking you 10 years to kind of stop and aim when you're going 50 kilometers an hour, it's probably not the ideal situation. So with that being said, the tank actually feels really nice when you put in the vertical stabilizers. Obviously, this is the bond equipment that you can use on the vehicle. Now, you don't need it. Of course, it's just an additional boost. We've then also gone with increased shell resistance or hardening. Hardening's really nice to be able to essentially just increase the hit points. You want to be able to trade with the vehicle and find other opponents who are going to be looking to kind of chunk away a lot of your hit points. And if you have a little bit more to trade in a vehicle that does 440, especially in tier 8 games, you're going to, for the most part, be dealing more damage than almost everyone that you'll meet. Even heavy tanks may only have 390 alpha, some of them having considerably less if you're looking at the British line. So with that being said, when you have that alpha damage, you can really start to learn how to trade with this high alpha damage gun. And although the damage per minute of the vehicle is not that great, you can use it more effectively. You know, you only have to pull around a couple times as opposed to a lot of the other medium tanks, which are going to have to kind of maintain their exposure to the opponents, where they're going to get hit more times, they're going to take a lot more damage in engagements and potentially get surprised a lot more by another opponent who may crop up whilst you're trying to get off the second shot to kind of equal the damage that you'll be dealing in this vehicle. So that's always an advantage of playing these higher alpha damage tanks, and hence why you sacrifice some of the DPM that you'll see with other vehicles at the tier. Now, even with that being said, it does feel a little bit awkward in some situations due to the longer reload. You've got 11.69 second reload with this tank, but it doesn't feel awful. I really do think that the damage output of this tank feels okay. You're not really going to have any issues in the long run playing this vehicle, and if you play it smart, you'll be able to really make use of that. Now, that's not the only thing. Of course, we talked about damage per minute, but you want to be able to maximize it as much as possible, which is why we've actually running the loading system or gun rammer, so that we can essentially basically boost up our DPM. We want as much as possible. This tank is limited by the DPM, so if we can increase it, it's going to be the biggest thing for the vehicle, and it makes it a lot easier to trade in those situations because you're not waiting 13 seconds but significantly less in 11.69. So with that being said, obviously there's a lot of nuance to this vehicle and how it plays, and almost like a hybrid between the heavy and the medium playstyle, although I don't think anyone is going to be saying that this tank has particularly the best armor to deal as a heavy tank, but it almost plays in the gun statistics wise as a heavy vehicle. So of course we've touched on the armor model, but what about the actual armor? Now then, straight off the bat you can visually see that the front of the vehicle is very, very flat when it comes to the turret armor, which is one of the biggest weak points of playing things like the Chimera. It's this very, very flat top half and a very, very flat bottom half with kind of a circular mid section that can still be penned. It's just if someone hits this ridiculous angle on there, it can maybe bounce, but for the most part you're still going to take a lot of damage even if they hit the super angled bit as it kind of tapers in. But of course you've got a mantlet as well. However, this isn't a typical mantlet where you can't be penned in it. This one certainly can be penned in the mantlet, and multiple times I've been penned in this mantlet. So you have to be very aware of what the armor is actually like. So as you can see, just with these standard rounds with 218 pen on the Chimera itself, the tank is basically paper. You can pen it through the turret, you can pen it through the cupola, and literally tier 6s can pen you through the cupola. You've also got this upper plate, which a lot of vehicles at tier 7 will be able to go straight through, and often because of the low profile of this vehicle you're going to be looking from above it, which means that you're not really going to get that effective armor over here as much as you may want when you're looking like this. So it does definitely decrease, and so most vehicles, if they're heavy tanks or maybe even taller mediums, are going to look down onto you, making your upper plate even worse. And you can see the top section of the upper plate, which you can see here when you're looking down onto it, is only 80 millimeters of effective armor, which is garbage. Most people are going to pen you with this thing, and you probably aren't going to be able to kind of bounce anything with that rounds. But of course there's some nuance to this vehicle where you can actually make the armor relatively thick. And that is where the side scraping of this vehicle can come in quite nicely. You can see here that if you angle like this and you were to turn the turret such that you're kind of exposing this bit, as you pull around the corner, they really can't pen you if the corner was up to the where you start to get that flat armor on the turret. And so when you angle like this, you can often pull off a few bounces. Now, people could potentially get a shot into the backside of the engine deck, but of course they'd overmatch that, and so you can end up taking damage in that way. So if you're coming up against them, just be careful of that. But a lot of people will try and go for this upper kind of side plate over here, which when you're actually angling properly, it's not that easy to go through. You'll see that often it's a ricochet, and so yeah, you can ricochet off of it up into the turret, which is always good. So that is potentially a problem that you'll face in this tank, but that's where you've got to really try and side scrape with this vehicle. If people are coming at you, you want to try and wiggle as much as possible so that you can get this auto bounce angle and potentially bounce around where you might have taken damage. So if you can angle like this is kind of your effective armor where you can actually have a decent game. Of course, if people are above you, they're going to be able to pen you through this because it's no longer at a steep angle. So overall, armor-wise, looking pretty okay for a medium vehicle. And so unlike a lot of the Soviet heavies that have high alpha at the tier, you want to actually be angling at almost all times to be able to have the most effective armor and just wiggling like I said earlier. And if you do that, you can pull off a few bounces over time, but remember the armor model is pretty sucky and you're going to take a lot of damage for the most part and almost all the time through the turret armor if they do hit your turret. So just be aware of that. And there's really nowhere that they can actually bounce off the turret unless they hit the very most outer edge of the mantlet, which even then is quite a slim kind of area where they can actually bounce. So just be aware of that. And as with most of the British tanks within the game, you've also got 10 degrees of gun depression, which is more than enough to deal with a lot of the hill areas, and you'll certainly be able to find some shots that a lot of other people won't be able to do. It's just when you do that, you can kind of limit the cupola or the view of the cupola from the opponent, so that always helps, and of course improve the angle on the top of the turret, but most people are still going to be able to go through the lower part of your turret. So just when you are peeking, you want to do it quickly, but of course make sure that you're scoring those hits with the 440 alpha. So without further ado, let's take a look at what this tank can actually do in the hands of one of the more experienced players of playing the Chimera. So with this vehicle, we're of course looking at Pearl River, and Pearl River is a decent map for this vehicle. There's a lot of opportunity where you can essentially find yourself in these kind of corner fighting engagements where that alpha damage can really be the big step for you to gain a ton of damage really early on. And with the Chimera, of course, you can push forward, you can try and use some of that armor, and if people try and kind of get shots onto you, you can end up bouncing, and there you go, people ending up actually hitting the side of the vehicle at this ridiculous angle and actually bouncing, which is, like I said earlier, one of the things that you can do to stop being penned as easily. You don't want to expose your frontal armor to people because it really will be penned by almost everything. So with that being said, he gets forward straight away, picking up 523 damage with the first shell, picking up a little high roll, and obviously he seems to have annoyed one of the enemy players in the CS here, and he manages to hit him with one shell. He's now baiting him round the corner, allowing him to gain a full almost reload before the CS can even see him, and now it's just a case of maybe taking one hit and finishing him off, angling like we said earlier to be able to actually bounce the CS again, and once again up to 1.2 thousand damage, finishing off the CS from full health without really any problems at all, not even taking a single hit. So a really brilliant start and a classic example of how you can use a tank with not a lot of armor normally and still end up having bounces. So if you see this tank in the game and you're seeing that they are angling, you've really got to make sure that you hit the lower plate or the upper plate of this tank when it does try to angle. Don't go trying to go for the side of the vehicle, as that is a common misconception that it is an easy pen. So just be aware of that the side plate on the front, this is not an area where you go for with this vehicle, unless of course you've got super high penetration and it's actually angled in the right way and you're also looking down onto it. So with that being said, up to 2,000 damage now, and realistically this is the sort of position you want to be with the Chimera, where people are looking up into you, because that improves the angle of that upper plate to almost impenetrable, and it improves the turret armor, avoids people being able to see your cupola as well, or limits the view of it. And realistically, a lot of the tanks on the enemy team, given that this is a tier 8 game, are really going to struggle. But this is where the 440 is just king. You can see that tanks, if they go in the wrong position, they just get punished so hard, and the accuracy of this tank just makes it feel even better. It's not like you're firing an absolute potato. It really does hit where you actually aim to a degree. Obviously occasionally you get RNG'd out of the game, but at the same time it really isn't bad at all. And when you're starting to run V-stabs, you're going to find yourself in a nice position, and often people will try and trade off the V-stabs for some of the other equipment, maybe a turbo, which I guess could be beneficial, but for the most part maybe dropping the rammer to be able to pick up the turbo might be beneficial in some situations, but in general I probably wouldn't do either. Now he's in a bit of a predicament here. He's trying to deal with the southern flank of the game, as you probably should when you've lost it that bad, but of course he's getting shot from the side as well. Things like the Nomad are over there, and he really needs to push forward to try and get rid of the Challenger, who's kind of pushed down and holding up the team, being a bit of a nuisance. But if he can find anyone else that's kind of sat at the back and help his team out, then he really needs to do that. If he doesn't sort out this flank and help the team actually progress, because no one seems to want to be able to do that, then he's going to find himself basically losing the game. And so with the Challenger starting to take quite a few hits, it looks like they're going to finish that one off, but he's starting to have doubts as to whether or not the enemy team are just going to roll into the cap. It's probably likely that they're going to go and do that, so he needs to be in a position to deal with these guys before they end up capping the game and before they end up rolling around into the base and finishing off the rest of his team that are over there. The first tank to get spotted was an FSV Schmalterm, who gets removed very quickly by the Cheeto and the SU-130, as you can probably expect. But at the same time, there is this EOC who's going to be a right pain in their backside spotting for them. And considering that the Saladin has somewhat of a brain pushing up to the position to try and get a few shots into the SU, he could do with helping out his TDs in the base by removing some of these guys. So he gets into position, and it's all about positioning with this vehicle. If you can find spots throughout the game, just finding maybe 4 or 5 positions during the game where you can get one shot each, you can easily consistently deal over 2,000 damage. And granted that you can do that in most vehicles if you do that, but this one really does reward you because of that high alpha damage. And you can see here the Jito or the Juto is actually out in the open and puts one straight into him, picking up nearly 4,500 damage so far with 1,000 blocked. And this is the perfect kind of result that you want in this tank. And of course, having done quite a few shots in this game, he's also picked up 3 of the enemies as well. So if you're trying to get XP and if you're trying to kind of push yourself to the next level within your games and learn how to take a medium tank and turn it into something different that isn't usually what medium tanks are like, then this is a nice in between playing a medium and a heavy, and really is just very, very interesting to play in terms of what I think. Anyway, I'll be interested to see whether you guys really think that the Chimera is all that, or whether you think it's terrible. Maybe you've played it, I'd be interested. But either way, within this game, the enemy team have started to take out some of the TDs, especially the SU-130 PM, and the game is still quite close at this point, where you really have to start to think about what is the next best play that he can do, because he's been sat in the same sort of spot. And when you stay in the same sort of spot, often you can find yourself in periods where you're not doing a lot, and although it may have worked at the beginning, you can end up kind of losing out on damage throughout the game. So that's exactly what he's thinking here. He's thinking, do I push down? And if he pushes down, he's got to commit, because if you don't, you're going to get pumped from the right hand side of where he is now. The enemy has been taken out. The EOC is the only thing that was last spotted over here, so if he can get a couple shots into the EOC, maybe he can really do quite well. He loads back to the standard rounds because you don't need APCR for an EOC, and in fact he'd probably be better off loading the HE with the Chimera to try and pen this EOC, but I guess he's kind of thinking that EOC isn't on a huge amount of hit points, and he misses the shot. A little bit of a clutch situation there. Could have done with removing the EOC, and certainly if he loaded HE, he could remove this EOC from full health, because the HE damage on this vehicle when you're using it is actually pretty good. You've got 530 average damage with pen of 64, which for an EOC is going to be absolutely fine. But unfortunately, he doesn't get any of the damage, and maybe will only be able to get a small minor amount of 84. So a little bit unfortunate not to hit the EOC, but the game is not over. There is still 1,500 damage left in this game, and based on his current result, he's sitting at 7,000 WN8 game so far. And obviously, with a little bit more damage left in the game and with 720 hit points, he can certainly work this game even further into the realms of the 10,000 WN8, and of course going up on his marks of excellence, which he seems to be kind of grinding out at the minute, only having the 1 at this moment in time. Now, I've skipped ahead just a little moment just so that you don't have to watch him mobilizing himself around the map, but he's managed to come into the central area, hoping to find someone who might be lurking around here. And of course he finds himself the Saladin, who he goes in for the ram, of course trying to avoid that frontal armor being there. Can he push him up against the rock, enabling him to get some more damage? Yes, he can. He takes a few hits because of the fact that the Saladin sat on top of him, but that's fine. But he is now basically a one-shot, and if he had the hardening within this vehicle, he would be on an extra 160 damage, I believe, something like that. So he would be able to take any of the enemy team's hits, but because that he hasn't, there's a Cheeto on the enemy team and a Juto who are definitely potentially able to remove this guy from his last remaining hit points if they high roll. And so with that being said, that's where the hardening can really be beneficial in a vehicle like this. You can be a lot more comfortable in these sorts of situations towards the mid and late game where you've saved up some of your hit points and trying to make them work as you go through. So having dealt 5,000 damage, I'm sure he's not wanting to lose, and so knowing that the Juto has started to push towards the base, he's going to go all that way. He was probably thinking that the Cheeto and the Juto were going to combine up together, and he actually gets spotted, which means that the enemy Cheeto is most likely over here, if not in the base over here still, as he gets spotted going through the middle. And so with him being spotted, it kind of gives away the element of surprise, and the Juto's probably not going to poke out to try and get a shot on the Cheeto on his team. But of course he still pushes out and gets removed by the 50 TPR who is sat out in the area. So now that they know that the Cheeto is probably in this sort of area where he was before, looking over in the kind of central area over here, he's got a choice as to whether to try and poke here and see if he can spot him that's going to be pushing up. And you'll see very quickly if he is actually over on the left, and I'm sure that that's what he's thinking right now. He doesn't get spotted, so that probably means that the Cheeto is not over here or in the middle, but in fact still at the base. So with the 50 TP, a one shot, as well as his teammate in the Campingberg, or the Cheeto SP, still in base, not moving, he has a little bit of a decision to make whether to try and push forward. And unfortunately, even with the very good view range of this vehicle, he does get hit for that shell, and that takes 274 of his hit points away, leaving him a guaranteed one shot for the Cheeto SP. So he cannot do anything else right now, which is where he is kind of calling for his tank destroyer to move up with him, and so he's going to have to do something and basically play quite passively. So I'll give you a moment and we'll kind of come back when the Cheeto on his team has kind of moved up. So the Cheeto does indeed get spotted in the base. Can he get the shot off into him? Yes, he can. 280 extra damage, picking up 5.3k total damage in this vehicle, and certainly a really fun one to actually take a look at this vehicle. I really enjoyed playing it throughout the many games that we did in actually play with it, and hopefully you guys will kind of give the respect that the Chimera deserves with its 440 alpha, and certainly you'll find out not to be shooting it here, but indeed in the frontal armor, even when it is angled. So with that being said, hopefully you enjoyed. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see some more gameplay and World of Tanks content, then that would be massively helpful for me, as well as keeping up to date with my content for you. Hopefully you join me back in the next one, and I'll see you there.